The sun shone brightly over the castle. But for Sir Aldrich, the most loyal and dedicated of the king's guard, nothing seemed more important than protecting the crown. He had spent years at his post, immune to the outside world, focused only on duty, a vow he would never dare to break. The king depended on him. The other guards relied on his strength and courage. And he had always believed that his life would be defined by this: loyalty, duty, and discipline. But in a single moment, everything changed. A stranger appeared in front of the castle, out of nowhere. Eleanor, a single mother, lost in the vastness of the world. She was there just to look. A simple tourist who would probably never realize the impact she would have on Aldrich's life. Their eyes met instantly. A brief but intense connection, as if fate had chosen that moment, that place, to intertwine their lives. He didn't know her name, nor where she came from, but something in her gaze made his heart stray from the right path. But then, she was gone, and Aldrich remained there, motionless, struggling against something he could not understand. How could something as simple as a glance make his soul tremble in such a powerful way? Would he ever see her again? Or did that fleeting encounter mean something far greater? In the days that followed, Sir Aldrich maintained his firm stance, as he always had. But something inside him had changed. He knew that fate had brought this woman to him, and out of all the people he saw every day, none had been like her. He wondered, who was she? Why can't I stop thinking about her? Aldrich's duty, above all else, was to protect. He knew this and forced himself to focus on his responsibility. Yet, his soul was restless, as if an invisible force were calling him, urging him to go after her. He tried to convince himself that she wouldn't return, that the exchange of glances had meant nothing. But every morning, as he took his position at the castle gates, he found himself hoping to see her. Without even realizing it, he was creating an expectation. And every time his eyes scanned the crowd, he searched, unintentionally, for that face. The wait was agonizing but also mesmerizing. Every day, Aldrich watched the street in front of the castle, his eyes alert to every movement, hoping for that magical moment once again. But she never returned. The emptiness within him grew deeper with each passing day. And finally, he began to wonder, what if she never comes back? What if that brief moment was all I will ever have? The fear of never seeing her again started to consume his mind. How could he continue his life without even knowing her name? Fate seemed cruel, keeping her just out of reach, like a distant star he could never touch. Days passed slowly for Aldrich, as if the world around him had slowed to a crawl. Each dawn dragged on, and the silence of his watch had never been so deafening. He could no longer concentrate. His thoughts constantly returned to that woman. Her eyes, the way they shone, as if they spoke more than words ever could. But deep down, he knew this feeling was forbidden. Love was not for him. He was a king's guard. His life was dedicated to protecting the monarch. His loyalty was above any desire or personal dream. It was a vow that could not be broken, no matter what he felt. And yet, every day, as he took his post, his eyes searched for her, as if at any moment she would appear in front of the castle, waving at him once more. But she never did. The emptiness in his chest grew, but he tried to convince himself that the waiting was worth it, that perhaps it was better this way, not knowing anything about her. After all, what could he offer to a woman who did not belong to his world? She had her life, her children. He had the king. But the truth was, Aldrich could not forget. What should have been a fleeting memory had become an obsession. He felt increasingly torn. What would he do if he saw her again? His longing for her consumed his mind, making the wait even more painful. He knew he had to be patient, but the anguish was becoming unbearable. Every day was an internal battle. The desire to see her again was stronger than his loyalty to the king. Aldrich's life remained a lonely routine of vigilance, of duty. He had accepted, with sorrow, that he might never see her again. The pain of waiting had become part of his daily existence. But what he did not know was that fate had other plans. That morning, the wind was colder than usual, and Aldrich took his post in front of the castle, as he did every day. His eyes scanned the crowd with the same empty gaze as always until suddenly, he saw her. She was there, once again, standing across the street, her delicate figure contrasting against the castle's imposing architecture. Their eyes met again, and for a moment, it was as if the world had stopped. Seeing her there, in front of him, made his heart race in a way he no longer thought possible. But this time, something was different. She waved. It was not a simple farewell gesture. It was not a goodbye. It was a sign, a silent invitation. The kind of gesture that said, "I see you too. I feel this too." He almost lost control of his reaction. He almost ran to her, but he knew he couldn't. The vow he had taken was stronger than any fleeting desire. He looked away, trying to focus on the castle, but his mind was on fire. Eleanor turned away, and the emptiness returned. He tried, with all his strength, to suppress the urge to chase after her, but the silent love inside him grew. He needed to know more. He needed to find out who she was, where she came from, why fate had suddenly brought her into his life. With his heart still pounding, Aldrich swore he would find a way to see her again, to know more about her. Something inside him, an inexplicable force, told him that this woman had something more to offer than he could ever imagine. Night fell over the castle, but Aldrich could not rest. Her eyes, her subtle smile, her wave, all of it was engraved in his mind. He didn't know her name, nor where she came from, but he needed to find her. In the modern world, there was a logical path to follow: social media. If she was a tourist, she might have checked into the city, posted a photo, tagged a location near the castle. It was a glimmer of hope. As soon as his shift ended, he withdrew to his quarters and grabbed his phone. A frantic search began. He tried everything. He searched city hashtags, looked through photos taken in front of the castle. Nothing. No clues. No digital trace. It was as if Eleanor did not exist. Frustration grew inside Aldrich. The lack of information made it feel as though that encounter had been a distant dream. But he refused to give up. She had been there. She was real. And he would find her. Then, in a casual conversation with one of his fellow guards, an unexpected twist of fate came into play. "You've been acting strange lately, Aldrich. Is something wrong?" asked Sir Edmund, one of the oldest guards in the order. Aldrich hesitated. He would never speak about this feeling to anyone. But, for some inexplicable reason, he trusted Edmund. "I saw a woman a few days ago. I think she was a tourist. But I can't forget her." Edmund chuckled, crossing his arms. "Out of all the visitors that passed through here, you fell for a stranger." Aldrich didn't answer. His silence said everything. Edmund narrowed his eyes, thinking for a moment. Then, as if recalling something suddenly, he said, "I think I know who you're talking about. I saw a woman waving at you this morning." Aldrich's heart stopped for a second. "You know her?" "Know her? No. But if I'm not mistaken, she's staying at an inn where my cousin is lodged." Aldrich held his breath. Could it be her? Fate, which had once seemed cruel and unreachable, now offered an unexpected opening. "Where is this inn?" Aldrich asked. Edmund let out a heavy sigh, studying his friend. "Do you know what you're doing? If any officer of the guard finds out, this could cost you your position." Aldrich knew. But he also knew that living without knowing who she truly was, without hearing her voice even once, was a far greater price to pay. Edmund looked around, making sure no one was listening. Then, he whispered a name and an address. "But be discreet, understand." Aldrich nodded. But inside, everything was burning. After months of thinking he would never find her again, the answer had been right under his nose. Fate was truly incredible. That night, he walked through the city's stone streets, keeping to the shadows, hidden beneath a hood. He had never broken the rules before. He had never betrayed his position. But for her, he was willing to risk everything. When he reached the small inn Edmund had mentioned, he stood before its simple facade. Was the woman who had unsettled his mind with just 2 glances inside? He took a deep breath, thought about turning back, about giving up, but fate had already decided for him. With steady steps, he entered the inn's lobby. The receptionist eyed him with curiosity. "Can I help you?" He hesitated for a second. He didn't know her name. "I'm looking for a foreign woman. She checked in here recently." The receptionist narrowed his eyes, suspicious. "Who's asking?" Aldrich resisted the urge to tell the truth. "An old friend." The man remained silent for a moment, then nodded toward the side. "Last room upstairs." Aldrich's heart leaped. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a gateway to an unknown fate. When he reached the door, he took a deep breath and raised his hand, hesitating, ready to knock. But before he could touch the wood, the door opened. And there she was, Eleanor, holding a coat in one hand, surprised to see him there. Their eyes met once again. This time, There was no crowd, no distance. They were finally face to face. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds. But for Aldrich, it felt like an eternity. Eleanor blinked, surprised, holding the coat in her hands tightly. What was he doing here? How had he found her? You, she began, but her voice faltered. Aldrich had never been this close to her. Her scent was soft. Her gaze carried a mystery he longed to unravel. I know this might seem strange, but... Aldrich hesitated. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't admit that he had searched for her like a madman, spending nights trying to find her. So, he opted for something simpler. I needed to see you again. Eleanor smiled faintly, a smile almost shy, as if it didn't make sense to her either. But, at the same time, it made all the sense in the world. She glanced around discreetly, ensuring her children were asleep inside the room. Then, she took a step outside and closed the door behind her. How did you find me? Aldrich held his breath. A friend saw you waving at me and said he had seen someone like you at the inn where his cousin is staying, with 2 small children. I thought it might be you. She tilted her head, curious. And you didn't mind that I have 2 small children? That I'm a single mother? The question was risky. Aldrich could simply make something up, but he didn't want to run from what he was feeling anymore. What I felt for you the first time I saw you was magical. I don't care about your past, and your children will never be a problem. Eleanor's eyes widened for a moment, as if she wasn't prepared for such a direct answer. Aldrich saw something change in her expression, as if an invisible wall was beginning to fall. She took a deep breath and looked at the ground before responding. I'm just a mother trying to show my children a bit of the world. I didn't think anyone would notice me, much less someone like you. Aldrich furrowed his brow. Someone like me? She smiled faintly. You're a king's guard. Strong, loyal, from a world different from mine. And I'm just a woman who passed through here by chance. Aldrich took a step closer, feeling his heart race. You weren't a chance for me. Eleanor held his gaze. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say, but they both knew what they were feeling. The air between Aldrich and Eleanor was charged with something indescribable, an invisible connection, but impossible to ignore. He should leave. Every minute he spent there increased the risk of being discovered. But how could he simply turn his back and pretend she hadn't moved him in a way no one ever had? Aldrich knew that if he didn't say anything now, he might never get another chance. He took a deep breath and said, If I invited you out, would you come? Eleanor's eyes widened, clearly caught off guard. You're asking me out? She laughed, incredulous. Aldrich smiled, but it wasn't a joke. Yes. For a moment, Eleanor was silent. It was clear she was fighting against her own reason. Aldrich, her voice came out almost as a whisper. I don't know if this is a good idea. Eleanor was a tourist, a single mother with 2 small children. She wasn't here to live an impossible romance with a royal guard. But Aldrich wouldn't back down so easily. I know you're scared. But, if you tell me you didn't feel anything, I'll leave right now and never bother you again. Eleanor held her breath. He was giving her a choice, and she knew what the truth was. She ran a hand through her hair, nervous. Her mind screamed that this was a mistake, but her heart had already made its decision. After a few seconds of hesitation, she sighed and smiled faintly. Where do you want to take me? Aldrich's heart raced. Trust me, it'll be worth it. Eleanor laughed softly, shaking her head, unable to believe what she was doing. All right, Royal Guard, you won. He didn't yet know how he would make it happen without being discovered. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't back out. Aldrich returned to the palace that night with a racing heart. What was he doing? He was a king's guard, a man whose duty came above everything. And yet, there he was, risking everything for a woman he barely knew. But she wasn't just any woman. She was Eleanor. She had accepted his invitation. But how could he meet her without raising suspicion about his absence? That's when a bold idea came to him. The next morning, Aldrich found Edmund at the barracks. His friend was already eyeing him suspiciously. You did something stupid, didn't you? Aldrich couldn't hide his smile. I need a favor. Edmund crossed his arms. If it's what I think it is, my answer is no. You haven't even heard what I'm going to ask. Edmund sighed. You want me to cover for you? Aldrich didn't say anything, but the answer was clear in his eyes. Edmund looked around and lowered his voice. Do you have any idea the risk you're taking? If the commander notices you're not at your post. I know. Edmund studied his friend for a moment. He had never seen him like this. Aldrich had always been the most loyal of them all. What could make a woman have this much power over a man like him? After a long sigh, Edmund ran a hand over his face, defeated. God have mercy on both of us. Aldrich smiled. That night, dressed in simple clothes to avoid being recognized, Aldrich walked through the dark streets of the city until he reached the small stone bridge where he had arranged to meet Eleanor. When he looked up, there she was. Eleanor was wearing a beige coat, her hair flowing freely in the wind. When she saw him, she smiled in a way that made all the risk worthwhile. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, as if memorizing the moment. "You came," she whispered. Aldrich took a step forward. "I would have crossed the world for this." The silence between Aldrich and Eleanor wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with anticipation. "You're really here," Eleanor murmured, as if she still couldn't believe he had risked everything to see her. Aldrich smiled slightly. "Yes, and so are you." Eleanor lowered her gaze, holding the coat tighter against her body. "I almost didn't come." Aldrich felt his heart race. "Why?" She took a deep breath before answering. "Because something tells me that, if I take this step, there will be no turning back." Aldrich should have said something sensible. He should have said that yes, this was dangerous, that it was wrong. But instead, he simply said, "Then let's take this step together." Eleanor raised her gaze, surprised. Aldrich extended his hand to her, like an invitation to the unknown. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated. But then, slowly, she intertwined her fingers with his. The touch was warm, firm, real. They walked through quiet alleyways, where the lights of the houses were still on. Aldrich led her to a small cafe hidden at the end of a square, where the city seemed to be asleep. They sat in a discreet corner, away from curious eyes. "This place," Eleanor looked around, enchanted. "It feels like a well-kept secret." Aldrich smiled. "Just like us." Eleanor felt a flutter in her stomach. She shouldn't get involved. But it was too late for that. And then, as time seemed to slow around them, they realized there was no turning back. The next morning, Aldrich returned to the castle as if nothing had happened. But inside, he felt like something had changed forever. He had broken the rules, and he would do it again. As he walked through the great hall, he felt the sharp gaze of his commander, Sir Roland, upon him. Aldrich, his name sounded like a sharp blade cutting through the silence. He turned, keeping his posture stiff. "Yes, sir." Sir Roland studied him for a moment, his gaze full of suspicion. "You disappeared last night. You weren't at the barracks after hours." Aldrich's heart raced. "I went to bed early, sir." Roland narrowed his eyes. "Are you sure?" Aldrich didn't blink. "Yes, sir." The commander fell silent for a few seconds, as if trying to decipher him. But in the end, he just muttered something inaudible and walked away. Aldrich let out a quiet sigh. He had gotten away with it, for now. But the weight of the secret was on his shoulders. And the castle was not a place where secrets survived for long. Later, he found Edmund, who pulled him into a discreet corner. "What happened?" Edmund whispered. "Did you see her?" Aldrich nodded. "Yes." His friend stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "You're playing with fire, Aldrich. If anyone finds out." "No one will find out." Edmund ran a hand through his hair, nervous. "You know I can't cover for you forever, right?" Aldrich knew. But at that moment, nothing else mattered. His thoughts were consumed by her. Eleanor. Aldrich knew he was being watched. Since he started meeting with Eleanor, he could feel the eyes of his superiors on him. But it wasn't until one night, after one of their meetings, that the truth struck him like a sword blow. He was sneaking back into the castle, as he had done before. But this time, there wasn't enough darkness to hide him. A silhouette blocked the entrance to the barracks. It was Sir Roland. "Aldrich." His tone was pure steel. Aldrich kept his expression firm, but his heart raced. "Sir." Sir Roland crossed his arms. "Where have you been?" A silence fell between them. Aldrich knew that lying was pointless. His commander already knew the answer. "I made a mistake, sir." Roland narrowed his eyes. "A mistake? Or a choice?" Aldrich said nothing, and then came the sentence. "You are suspended. 2 weeks without active service. And, until then, you will not leave the castle." It was like a blow to the chest. 2 weeks, without seeing her, without even speaking to her, and there was something worse. Starting today, All personal phones are prohibited in the Royal Guard's wing. Aldrich felt the world spin. He wouldn't even be able to warn her. The following days dragged on. He spent hours training, trying to drown his frustration in the weight of his sword. But nothing helped. Did she think he had abandoned her? That thought was unbearable. Aldrich had never felt so powerless. But he knew one thing. As soon as his suspension ended, he would do anything to find her again. The weeks of suspension were the longest of Aldrich's life. He counted the days, each one more suffocating than the last. His uniform remained hanging in the same place, untouched, and the weight of the sword he used to carry seemed lighter compared to the weight of Eleanor's absence. He wondered if she was still waiting, if she had understood his silence, or if, on the contrary, she felt abandoned. On the last night of his suspension, he barely slept. When the sun rose and he was officially reinstated to duty, he felt an immediate relief. He was free to search for her. He tried to contact her on the phone but couldn't get through. Had she already left the inn, or gone back to her country? As soon as his first shift back on duty ended, he walked through the city, heading straight to the inn. But she wasn't there anymore. Eleanor had disappeared. He felt the fear spread through his chest. He had waited so long to find her. But what if it was already too late? That's when an idea came to him. He found Edmund in the barracks and told him what was happening. "You know I can't help you find her, Aldrich. We've already gotten into too much trouble with this. I just need a clue. A name. A contact. Anything." Edmund sighed, hesitant, but then furrowed his brow as if he remembered something. "Wait, she was always with the children, wasn't she?" "Yes. And they were young." Aldrich nodded, still not understanding. "There's a school near the Central Market. Why don't you try going there?" Aldrich's heart skipped a beat. There's a chance. That was enough. The next day, Aldrich made his way to the school, unsure if he would be welcomed, unsure if she even wanted to see him. But it was his only option. Aldrich stood across the street, watching the gate of the small school. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat pushing him forward. But he hesitated. Time seemed to drag. He saw parents arriving, children running out through the gate, teachers saying their goodbyes. Then, amidst the flow of people, he saw her. Eleanor was there, her hair loosely tied, wearing a light coat and holding the children's backpacks as she smiled at them. The sight hit him hard. For weeks, he had feared she had disappeared from his life forever. But there she was, real, close, and even more beautiful than he remembered. He needed to go to her. He needed to speak to her. But before he could take a step, Eleanor lifted her gaze and saw him. Her smile disappeared in an instant. Her body tensed. And for a moment, Aldrich saw a mixture of surprise, relief, and pain in her eyes. She quickly turned to the children and said something to them, pointing to the car. They obeyed without question, walking eagerly to the vehicle. Eleanor stayed behind. Then, she began to walk toward him. He tried to prepare himself for what was to come, but nothing could have prepared him for her words. "Where have you been?" Her voice was firm, but there was a tone of pain there. Aldrich opened his mouth, but he couldn't speak right away. He didn't know where to start. You disappeared." She cut him off, crossing her arms. "Without explanations. Without anything. I thought you." She stopped, looking away for a moment, before staring at him again. "I thought you had regretted it." Aldrich felt a tightness in his chest. "No, never." "Then why?" she asked. Aldrich looked around, noticing some people were starting to pay attention. He took a step closer and lowered his voice. "I can't talk here, but I never wanted to leave. I never wanted to leave you waiting." She was still hurt. He could see it in her eyes, but he also saw something else there. She still cared, and that was all he needed. "Please," he said, almost a whisper. "Let me explain." Eleanor sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she said, "Tonight, at the cafe where we used to meet." Aldrich nodded, feeling both relief and anxiety at the same time. "I'll be there." Eleanor didn't say anything else. She simply turned and walked to the car, where her children were waiting. Aldrich stood there, watching her leave, with one certainty. Tonight would decide everything. Aldrich arrived at the cafe earlier than agreed. Impatience consumed him. Eleanor entered without taking her eyes off him. Her face was serious, but not closed off. She wanted answers. Without saying a word, she sat in the chair across from him. "I'm listening," she said, crossing her arms. Aldrich took a deep breath. I was suspended. Eleanor furrowed her brow. What? One of the officers found out I was sneaking out of the castle. He reported me to my superior, and I was immediately suspended. They prohibited me from leaving and from using any personal communication. He saw her expression change. The frustration that was there before gave way to surprise. You couldn't talk to me? No. I didn't even know how to find you. All I could do was wait, hoping you wouldn't give up on me. Eleanor looked away for a moment, processing his words. The pain of the absence had been real, but now, at least, she had a reason. I thought you had just moved on, she confessed softly. Aldrich leaned in closer. I would never do that. The silence between them was heavy. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they were both absorbing the situation, adjusting the pieces that had been left loose. After a few seconds, Eleanor let out a deep sigh and relaxed her shoulders. I shouldn't be here, she said, a small smile forming. But here I am. Aldrich felt a wave of relief and warmth flood his chest. And I never wanted to be anywhere else. They looked at each other for a few moments, and then Eleanor picked up her cup of coffee and took a sip. So, you're back to service now? Yes. And hopefully, no one will suspect anything. He spoke as if the danger had already passed, as if the problem was a thing of the past. But he didn't know that, at that very moment, fate was preparing another twist. When they left the cafe, Aldrich held the door for Eleanor to pass, and then walked beside her, both strolling down the sidewalk carelessly. That's when something caught his attention. On the other side of the street, a man dressed in the Royal Guard uniform was standing, watching them. The captain. Aldrich's body tensed instantly. The captain's gaze was sharp, laden with judgment. He didn't need to say anything. He simply turned on his heel and started walking in the opposite direction. Aldrich felt a chill run down his spine. Is something wrong? Eleanor asked, noticing the change in his expression. He didn't respond immediately. He just followed the captain's figure with his eyes as it disappeared into the crowd. Then, he finally said, "We need to leave. Now." Eleanor furrowed her brow. "What's going on?" Aldrich quickened his pace, gently holding her arm. "He's going to tell the king." Eleanor stopped walking. "What?" Aldrich closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I was seen. And now, there's no turning back." Eleanor felt her heart race. "What does that mean?" Aldrich looked into her eyes, the seriousness of a man who knew the weight of what would come next. "It means the king will know about us. And if the king knew, there were no guarantees about what would happen next." Aldrich's fate was about to be decided. The next day, Aldrich walked through the castle corridors with firm steps. But inside, his heart beat like a war drum. He had been called to the presence of the king. There were no precedents for this. Never had a guard been summoned directly for a royal audience for reasons like this. Ahead of him, the massive doors to the throne room were slightly ajar. Guards stood in position, imposing but discreet. "Enter," announced one of the royal advisors. Aldrich took a deep breath and entered the grand hall. The king sat on his throne, calm and pensive. He wore his traditional royal attire, and his presence radiated authority. Beside him, the captain of the guard stood rigidly, as if eagerly awaiting the punishment of his subordinate. "Aldrich," the king's voice echoed through the hall, deep and laden with weight. "Do you know why you are here?" Aldrich didn't hesitate. He straightened up, maintaining the impeccable posture he had always carried as a royal guard. "Yes, your majesty." "Then tell me," the king continued, "why did one of my most loyal guards decide to break the rules he swore to follow?" Silence filled the hall. The captain crossed his arms, waiting for a response that would confirm his suspicions. Aldrich raised his gaze. He knew that, at this moment, there was only one thing he could say. "The truth. Because I love her, your majesty." The king remained still. His expression revealed nothing of what he was thinking. Aldrich continued, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "She is not just a woman who crossed my path. She became part of me before I even realized it. I spent years serving the castle, dedicating every day of my life to the crown, never imagining that one day my heart would find something greater than duty." The captain cleared his throat, impatient. "With all due respect, your majesty, he has broken fundamental rules. A royal guard cannot simply put his feelings above duty." The king raised his hand, signaling for silence. The captain bit his tongue and stepped back. The king's gaze turned back to Aldrich. "You knew the risks, yet you still chose to follow her." "Yes, your majesty." And you did not hesitate, even knowing that Eleanor has 2 children? Aldrich furrowed his brow, confused. Why would I hesitate? The king leaned slightly back in his throne. Many men would not be willing to take on a woman with children. They would look for an easier path. I'm not like most men. The king kept his gaze on him for a long moment. Then, something unexpected happened. A subtle smile appeared on the king's lips. I know. The captain's eyes widened, but he did not dare interrupt. The king rose and took a few steps toward Aldrich. His presence was overwhelming, but not oppressive. He stopped in front of the guard and looked deep into his eyes. You have always been an excellent soldier, said the king, his voice firm and carrying something else, respect. Honorable, dedicated, and, from what I see, noble at heart. Aldrich's heart pounded. What did this mean? The king turned and returned to the throne. His expression grew serious once more. You will be admonished, he said, looking directly into Aldrich's eyes. I never want to hear again that you snuck out of the castle or neglected your post. Yes, your majesty. The king then looked at the captain, who seemed on the verge of exploding with disbelief. And as punishment, the king continued, leaving a suspenseful pause in the air, you will have a marriage worthy of a man loyal to his king. The silence in the room was so complete that Aldrich heard his own heart stop for a moment. The captain choked slightly. Your majesty. The king shot him a stern look. True love is as strong as the walls of this castle, he declared, his voice filling every corner of the hall. And there is no reason to punish a man for something few have the courage to admit. He turned to Aldrich. You have served me loyally for years. Now, I will serve you as your king. Your wedding will be held here, at the castle. It will be a celebration worthy of the nobility of your heart. Aldrich felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He had never expected the punishment he would receive to actually be a gift. He immediately knelt. I don't know how to thank you, your majesty. The king smiled. Just continue being the man you've always been, Aldrich. And now go and tell your future wife that I have blessed your love. The captain, though clearly displeased, had no choice but to remain silent. Aldrich left the throne room with his heart racing. His fate had been sealed, not with a punishment, but with a future alongside the woman he loved. Now, he just needed to tell Eleanor. The sun bathed the castle towers in golden light when Aldrich left the audience with the king. His steps were firm, but his mind was in ecstasy. He was free to live his love. Not only that, he would have a wedding worthy of the story that united them. But before any celebration, there was something he needed to do. He ran through the cobbled streets of the city, dodging carriages and pedestrians. His heart raced, not out of fear, but out of excitement. He had to see her. Eleanor needed to know. When he arrived at the cafe where it all began, his eyes searched desperately for her. And there she was, sitting by the window, a book in her hands, oblivious to the storm of emotions Aldrich carried. Without thinking, he entered and walked directly to her. Eleanor. She looked up, surprised. Aldrich. Her voice was a mix of relief and happiness. He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. I spoke to the king. Eleanor furrowed her brow, sensing the nervousness in his voice. What happened? He took a deep breath. He knows about us. The captain saw us together and informed him. I thought it would be the end of my career, the end of everything. She held her breath. And was it? Aldrich smiled, a bright light in his eyes. No. The king saw the truth. He saw my love for you. And because of that, he paused, savoring the moment. He gave us his blessing to marry. The book slipped from Eleanor's hands and fell onto the table. What? Aldrich laughed, unable to contain his happiness. The king is organizing a wedding for us at the castle. Eleanor blinked, trying to process the words. But, why? Because he saw something I have always known, said Aldrich, gently holding her face. That true love is worth any risk. Eleanor brought her hand to her lips, her eyes sparkling with tears. Is this really happening? It is, he confirmed, caressing her cheek. If you say yes. She laughed through her tears. Yes. He pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling her heart racing against his. They had won. And finally, the big day. The castle corridors were adorned with white and golden flowers. Chandeliers sparkled with thousands of candles, and the grand throne room had been transformed into a hall of celebration. The king, in all his majesty, watched everything with a satisfied gaze. Aldrich, dressed in his ceremonial uniform, stood at the makeshift altar, his hands sweaty from anxiety. He had never been so nervous in his life. Not in battles, not in training. Nothing had prepared him for the emotion of seeing her walk toward him. And then, she appeared. Eleanor emerged from the center aisle, wearing a simple yet stunning white dress. Her hair was styled in a delicate updo, and her eyes sparkled more than any jewel in the hall. By her side, 2 young attendants held her hands, her children. They walked together, delivering her to the man who would now be part of their lives. Aldrich felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't just Eleanor, it was a family, and he was ready to be a part of it. She reached him, and Aldrich took her hands gently. "You look beautiful, and you're sweating." He laughed, feeling the weight of the moment. The king stood and, with his firm voice, began the ceremony. "Today, we not only unite 2 souls but celebrate true love, which surpasses barriers and defies fate." The vows were exchanged. Words of love were spoken, not just with their mouths, but with their eyes, with their touch, with everything they had lived to get here. And then came the final moment. "You may kiss the bride," announced the king, with a twinkle in his eye. Aldrich didn't wait a second. He pulled her close and kissed her as if the whole world had disappeared. At that moment, nothing else mattered. When they pulled away, the hall erupted in applause and cries of joy. Eleanor's children jumped for joy, running to embrace them both. Aldrich held them in his arms, feeling the strength of the new life that was beginning. He had broken the rules for love, and because of that, he had gained something he never imagined: a home. The king raised his cup in a toast. "To the love that defies fate. To the love that defies fate." And that night, under the stars of the castle, Aldrich and Eleanor danced, surrounded by laughter, music, and the certainty that they had found what many spend their whole lives searching for: true love.